Good morning and welcome to Research Over Coffee. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. We also acknowledge the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people and communities who have been here for over 40 years. I'm Laura Hines-Jenkins, Director of Government Relations at Dalhousie University. I'm pleased to introduce today's guest, Dr. Jeff Karabanow. This morning, Jeff will shed light on the plight of young people caught up in the cycle of homelessness and marginalization. He will highlight lessons learned from over 20 years of study to inform our current homelessness and housing crisis and the policies and programs young people need to avoid the streets or to move from homelessness to housing. Jeff is a professor in the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University, who has worked with homeless populations in Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, and Guatemala. His research focuses primarily on housing stability, service delivery systems, trauma, and homeless youth culture. After Jeff's presentation, we'll be taking questions using the Q&A function of the webinar. I'll now turn it over to Jeff.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. So today's discussion is really a combination of kind of analysis and reflection, as well as my own kind of clinical work through the years with young people experiencing homelessness and exiting homelessness. It's basically a portrait of street life, of street culture, of the young people caught up in this. And this short presentation really accentuates their voices through the art that they've made with me, as well as the research that they've been part of. So it's entitled, Being Young, Being Homeless, and also Surviving in Unhealthy Environments. Surviving is an important piece because there's a lot of resilience and fragility and precarity in kind of their day-to-day worlds that I hope to highlight. And young people, are one of the fastest growing segments of the homeless population. So it's really, really key that we take heed of what is going on with this sector. This picture right here is from a comic book that was made by a few young people in one of my studies, and is a chapter in my last book. And I use it because the title, which is coined by them, A Long Way to Go, I think kind of announces the harsh trajectories of getting out of homelessness and finding a sense of community and belonging and care in their worlds. The next slide is, yes, this slide really just highlights where a lot of my research has come from. Different government, national, regional, and local government research bodies have supported my work. And I just want to highlight kind of some of the dynamics over the past while that I've worked with. I think to contextualize this discussion, we just need to remember that a lot of the trajectory of young people is caught up in webs or layers of inequities, injustices of the systems that they're in and out of. And these are systems that unfortunately sit pretty much in silos still today, where a lot of these young people find that they're only seen in just a particular element or dynamic of their being, as opposed to a more holistic young person that is going through a deep trauma. So, starting from like family strain, poverty, which is really woven into every fabric of these young people's lives, to child welfare systems that are under-resourced, that can be as abusive as and unhealthy as where they come from, to very murky pathways into employment, healthcare systems that have been shown that just can't support and serve these populations as best as they can, education systems that rarely meet the needs of these young people. Interesting stat is that over 1 in 2 young people on the streets have a deep diagnosed learning disability. To housing, that there's just as we all know, there's just it's inadequate right now, but also has a lack of actually age-appropriate styled housing. So these kind of intersecting systems kind of overlap their struggles in terms of attempting to kind of become citizens in their worlds. And it's also amplified by their age, their development stage, early adulthood or adolescent growth. So the murkiness of just that development stage, coupled with systems that don't really kind of see them in the ways that they need to be seen. And then you can also add the deep kind of systemic racism and discrimination for particular populations in these systems as well, has really kind of made it so difficult and oppressive for these young people. Next slide. I just wanted to highlight that while I'm going to kind of be pulling out kind of common threads here, this is a diverse population. It's deeply heterogeneous as any kind of subculture, sub-community. There's different codes, there's different languages, there's different street activities, there's different backgrounds. There's also overrepresentation of Indigenous and African Nova Scotian communities in the youth homeless population. The stages, which I'm going to just note briefly later on, are complex. I never want to imply that they are linear in any sense, but there's a complexity in terms of there's a psychological complexity in terms of crossing, how these young people actually get to the streets and work through a lot of the dynamics to get off the streets. And I'll kind of note that a bit later on. The notion of, we do need to see these folks as adolescents first and foremost. They're young adults, they're spirited, adventurous, they're resilient. They're dreamers, they fall in love, they question the world. They're at that stage of life that has a lot of beauty to it, but make no mistake that in this particular context, they have deep layers of trauma, spiritual, emotional, physical unhealthiness. They're exploited, they're fragile, they're neglected, they're suffering. And this is a deep, recurring, rarely treated set of trauma that is in their lives that kind of really define who they are. This is a picture. I made some animated shorts with young people a few years back. This is their depiction of what home looks like. We can move on. So some of the common threads to entry, and I'll go quickly through this. It's probably well known to most of you. This is a population that has a high level of past family dysfunction, including physical, sexual, emotional abuse. There's violence in the household. They're usually coming from contexts that are in crisis, chaotic, some with drug and alcohol experiences. So it is a environment where they begin their lives in a very chaotic manner. There's, I would say now about 65% of all young people on the streets have some form of child welfare involvement. That's a huge proportion, and I think it signals two key dynamics. One is that their earlier family experiences have shaped very problematic child welfare experiences, which is usually the case. But there's also, we need to be speaking to the indications of service provision failure here. Most young people characterize their group home foster care experiences as, equally violent and abusive and neglectful as family life. There's an issue of choice that's discussed sometimes in the media or in discussions around these dynamics. I think that's quite a fallacy. I think the vast majority become homeless due to external circumstances. The street is seen as a safer space from where they've left, which is very insightful. They're not running towards the street; they're actually running away from something, and rarely. We can hit the next slide. Rarely is there any safety and belonging. If the home is a place of love, security, and acceptance, then for the majority of young people living on the streets, they've been homeless or unhoused long before they've moved to the streets. This is another animated short that a young person made with me. And I think you have the links to the animated pieces. You're welcome to look at them and share them. So the next layer of kind of my research, initially my research really focused on the etiology of street life, and then it moved to kind of ethnographic analyses of kind of what goes on. The street is initially perceived as a place of freedom, of community, of relative security. This is kind of insightful for what's going on with the encampments. And I know I've been speaking to media quite a bit lately around, it's difficult to kind of, once you've found some form of safety, even if it's fleeting, it's difficult to kind of rearrange and uproot oneself. And this is the same with street culture. It has a relative security to it at first, but it quickly gets demystified. And for the most part, people speak to the street as an unhealthy, difficult, violent, lonely, and boring existence. They spend a lot of their efforts and their labor on securing food, shelter, clothing, employment, support. So they're in survival mode, and that from a traumatic dynamic as well, as they're consistently on edge. I've noted before that there's a lot of unhealthiness, physically unhealthy. All studies have highlighted the high rates of of physiological illnesses. Also, there's high levels of anxiety and depression in this population. There's really a sense of kind of non-citizenship, which is kind of one of my findings, but I was really surprised about. A lot of young people speak to this idea of they feel outside, they feel othered in their day-to-day lives. And I think a lot of it is shaped from the inequitable access to such basic needs like food and clothing and showers and healthcare and housing to support. And then we have these street communities that can be, at times can provide a sense of belonging, but are deeply divisive as well. Again, we're seeing this in the encampments right now. This sense of community exists for some, but they can be as uncaring and unreliable and as exploitative as other systems that they've been in. We can flip the slides. Again, an animated piece of a young person's depiction of what street life is like in Halifax. The next slide. Again, kind of tongue-in-cheek expose of the othering dynamic. These young people feel deeply isolated, marginalized, invisible, uncared for. And it's reflected in their drug and alcohol misuse, their street survival, their sex trade work, drug selling, anything to survive. They don't fit anywhere. So let's move into mapping these exiting dimensions. So how young people get off the streets. There's been very, very little research on this. I did a national study looking at how young people across the country actually work to exit street worlds. So I'll just quickly go through there. I've got a book on this, a few articles, so feel free to get more deeply into it. I kind of have shaped I think 6 kind of gentle dimensions to this. First one is the initial layer is around contemplation. It's around usually precipitating factors propel a kind of rethinking of street engagement. And it tends to be made up of a traumatic event. So an assault, for example, and an overdose, witnessing violence, involvement in the criminal justice is something that kind of jars them. Um, Also becoming disenchanted with culture, i.e., a lot of young people spoke to just this feeling of just had enough. It was too taxing. They've been worn down physically, emotionally, spiritually by just street existence. So that's kind of layer one, is this contemplation of realizing that where they're at may not be something that is benefiting them anymore. Layer two, next slide, involves kind of the courage to change. And it's highly influenced by factors as increased responsibility, for example, becoming pregnant, having an intimate partner, recognition that someone was dependent upon you, or realizing that someone cares for you, that you have support from family or friends. And with that kind of stems a kind of deeper emotional understanding of kind of being able to have your own agency, your own willpower to actually combat some of these impressive obstacles that you're living through. Layer three, the next slide, is deeply interrelated with layer two and involves, finally seeking actually available support. And this is primarily in relationship to housing and employment as the initial stage. It's about asking for help, which is very, very difficult for a lot of folks. I mean, not just young people, but it's about having available services that can support you at that moment, and also being articulating for young people to articulate enough kind of exactly what they need. Layer four, next slide, is starting this physical as well as emotional layering of transitioning. So you're actually physically moving away from the downtown core, which is most of street activity, and you're starting to construct or reconstruct a relationship with mainstream culture. No surprise that there's a deep relationship between the length of time on the street and the difficulties of actually the physicality of leaving the downtown core. It's slow, it's gradual. And what was really interesting was the nuanced emotions of confusion, guilt, abandonment, disloyalty, of actually thinking through even this leaving. And we find that a lot of young people go back and forth and they re-enter and exit street life, usually about 6 to 8 times before kind of really feeling like they're off. And the initial kind of realignment to street culture has to do with still seeing their friends and families on the streets, because there is that emotional attachment to many, as well as most of the organizations actually exist in the downtown core. So these young people still have to kind of build those networks or have these networks with the NGO world and need them. So they're kind of re-entering street life. The next layer is a more kind of profound changing of routine. And this usually has to do with kind of entering more the mainstream systems, such as school, employment, some form of supportive housing. It's about starting to build a renewed sense of health, wellness, personal motivation, starting to think of yourself kind of outside of that street world. And what's really interesting, and so there's some lovely quotations in my last book around how young people, actually my second book, around how young people, started to feel that shift in routine. It was very simple kind of feelings, like being able to wake up and make your own cup of coffee, sitting in your own place, not having to kind of move into survival mode just to kind of start your day. Really, there's these gentle little kind of pieces that we take for granted that were so significant in this kind of transitioning phase. And then the last stage, the last slide, kind of just coins successful exiting. And it's starting to actually see yourself as kind of a ex-street youth. You're kind of much more outside of that street culture. You're starting to build deeper connections with kind of mainstream culture. But also you starting to kind of, again, have hope and faith in your own abilities to control your external environments, your own situations. There's an emotional and spiritual shift in the individual. There's a deeper sense of stability, which makes a lot of sense. The next slide, kind of in summary of this stage of the talk. So there's these core findings. One-way pathways kind of off the street are fraught with trauma and inconsistencies. No surprise, they're not linear. Housing is important, and I know we've been speaking a lot about housing for the last year, and that's significant. Unfortunately, we hadn't been speaking about housing for so long, but it's not the panacea. It's not the only foundation. We know the stock of housing is not adequate right now in terms of, health, safety, affordability. Supports are significant. And this is where kind of like, I think youth-driven supports are really, really important, right? These are young people, some experiencing mental health, addiction, counseling is significant. We did a study on the relationship between some kind of psychological modalities and street youth kind of stability, seeing which kind of have a strength to them. And DBT, dialectic behavior therapy, kind of has some real efficacy here. Young people have difficulty connecting with mainstream culture, which is important to know. And this need for connection, this need for belonging. One of the core findings of my last two studies, which were longitudinal analyses of young people exiting the streets and being housed stably, was you had such a better chance of getting off if you had that one person in your life, that one individual that demonstrated unconditional love, much like, families in lots of ways, healthy families that can provide ongoing care and support day in and day out. But a lot of these young people don't have that, but they can find that one person that, can hold your hand through the ups and downs. Significant chances of actually exiting in a healthy way. So service provision is key. And I know, again, right now, locally, we're discussing, the form shelter and, why people aren't going there. And I kind of made a comment that I think they need, it'll take time. There needs to be a deeper relationship between the folks and the service delivery system. So for youth, supports are significant, and they become surrogate families. Good service delivery systems become kind of like surrogate families. And what I call in earlier writing, this idea of symbolic space. They provide a sense of sanctuary. They build strength of the individual. They work at an individual and a collective level in order to build a sense of critical consciousness and hope for young people. There's also eloquent critique of a lot of the systems, primarily in the adult world. And a lot of these young people kind of go back and forth between adult services and youth services. There's a sense of being unwelcomed. And we're seeing a little bit of this in the encampment world right now. Forced to become adults too quickly. There's too much pressure to kind of follow rules and structures. They feel controlled at times. This is more the youth perspective, excess rules and structures. I did a study of a supportive housing group here. And one of the core findings was people felt deep sense of respite in this system, but at the same time felt they were deeply surveilled, which is interesting, but that's kind of how most youth feel in their own families. So, like in a way that was really interesting that they're paralleling kind of like traditional family systems. Importantly, a lot of young people felt misunderstood in a lot of these systems. and I see this as kind of a lack of trauma-informed supports, lack of low barrier harm reduction dimensions. And also, like, a lot of young people have actually animals, for example, on the streets, and like systems need to kind of be able to adapt and accommodate the worlds of street culture. It can reinforce marginal identity, as well as we just have a lack of resources. So this is a 2012 that's been used a lot. It's the average monthly cost of housing people while homeless. It's from the Wellesley Institute. It's the famed kind of cost benefit analysis that we all use still, and there has not really been a really good one since that. Basically, you know, Canada in general, yes, we've done this here as well. We've been way too reactive. We tend to focus more on the kind of the emergency crisis rather than the preventative dynamics. And as you can see, any type of social community supportive housing comes out much, much more advantageous from a financial perspective than shelters and other formal systems. We know homelessness is expensive, right? It's for its health costs, it's policing, it's incarceration, it's social services. It disrupts neighborhoods, disrupts families, communities. There's much more humane and sustainable and compassionate ways and cost-effective ways to support the population. And I'm getting kind of to, like, I'm wrapping up. I'm not quite sure what time it is, but okay. The next slide. There's been some chatter around Housing First. We have a Housing First complex here in Halifax. Housing First has been kind of adopted federally as well as internationally. And basically, it's about this sense of, when you're on the streets, the best way to get off the streets is to be seen as housing as a foundation, as one deserves. It's a human right. We all deserve housing as a way to recover. It's not contingent upon kind of being ready or being compliant with a particular system, but housing actually can be that first layer that can kind of provide the preconditions for recovery. We have some diversion programs here. That means that kind of, like, attempting to redirect folks from falling on the streets. I direct a social work community clinic at Dalhousie. That's our housing support worker. 100% of the time is doing that, is doing diversion, making sure that people aren't falling onto the streets and to the shelter world. If that is, dealing with rental issues, dealing with food security, some issues between landlord and tenant that can be ameliorated, finding friends that can kind of support this individual community, just keeping people away from kind of falling more gravely onto the streets. Housing First has always argued that it should be the individual choice. Again, this is a discussion coming up with the encampments right now, that there should be diversity, housing in neighborhoods, scattered sites, congregate environments as well. And like I've noted, trauma and violence informed, harm reduction based, and also youth driven. I think this is the last slide, maybe, or I think 2%. And again, on this, I kind of call this on the ground, like, what's going on. So for young people, the types of housing that have been employed, and this is kind of more from international studies, first and foremost is if the home is a safe space. And I've done a lot of kind of family reconciliation work with families and young people. That's always kind of the key first point. If it is perceived as being a safe kind of return avenue. And then we have transitional, supportive, independent living. There's different styles of housing. Phoenix Youth Services kind of embodies all of these types. And that's kind of our one stellar system here that is working with young people. And within that, what we need those wraparound supports, right? Positive youth development based on people's youth strengths, resilience, not their deficits, a trauma-informed lens, harm reduction, having life skills built in, mentoring and meaningful engagement to kind of reconnect people back into society. And then my last slide. What what should we be doing? Well, A, we should be supporting work in the trenches. So all those NGOs that are working with a diversity of different philosophies and structures, they're providing sanctuary, they're providing Band-Aid, they're providing that connection. So that's, commemorable. We need to be supporting them. We also need something we lack is this interim kind of space, these transitional spaces. We know it's going to take a while for more sustainable long-term housing. We need these transitional spaces. Phoenix has a few kind of transitional housing pieces, but what happens is it gets clogged very quickly. People just can't move out to the kind of outside piece. So we need more. I ran a youth shelter in Montreal years ago, and they had these centre long term, centre jeunesse long term, which were kind of these medium level units that kind of like almost like SROs, single room occupancies across the city, that were places just to kind of put young people, when they were kind of exiting the shelter world. We wanted them away from the downtown, but we wanted them in some form of safe, stable environment where they could kind of start to build on those strengths to kind of become more stable. We're seeing this a lot more now, which is good, but that's the kind of relationship between the non-government organizational world, private sector, developers primarily, and government to focus on affordable and supportive and social housing. Those are really, really key. Bonding and bridge and social capital. We don't speak enough about this. The bonding of social capital is that deep kind of community connection between populations experiencing homelessness that we see. We're seeing it at the encampments in some level, but we also need to bridge that social capital. And that means kind of moving folks from that kind of street homeless kind of level of community to more mainstream civil society system. So, and we can do that through what's considered kind of community guides, those kind of mentors that can link, and in this case, young people to different types of employment, different types of mentors in the educational world, healthy family worlds that can kind of connect folks into different ways of being able to live in a more healthy manner than what they are. And that's kind of how I call intentional communities, is a sense that we really need to be strategic and intentional in how we kind of build these wraparound supports for these young people. In French, they have a term called entouré, which is, I think, lovely. It's kind of this enrapture of care for young people once they've exited systems. And that's really important because I think one of the big issues is that folks are exiting child welfare systems with very little support and probably too young to be able to take care of themselves. And again, lastly, is to shift focus to more preventative manners. I think we're speaking a lot about this now as we're in an unfortunate housing and homelessness crisis. We need to just kind of disentangle the myths and stereotypes of why young people are on the street, but also to kind of, change this dialogue and see young people as citizens of our community, as opposed to, clients or victims, or at worst, invisible. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. I'm Stefan Leslie. I'm the CEO of Research Nova Scotia. I'll be moderating the Q&A section. We've got about 10 minutes or so. We always try to end sharp at 9:15. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, and you can just pop your questions in there, and then I'll just moderate it. And I'm just going to get started, Jeff, with just kind of contrasting the housing first component that you described with those layers, beginning with contemplation, courage to change, all the way to successful exiting. And is there an inconsistency there, that if we're thinking about housing as the main challenge, but simply the provision of shelter without having gone through those other layers, if they're necessary, are we setting ourselves up for a successful progress against this?
So I see those layers as kind of fit really nicely with the housing first and the NGO world that's kind of on the ground. I think those first layers of contemplation usually happen with on the ground NGO service provider worlds. So I know when I was working on the streets, they, building a relationship with somebody, talking to him about options, allowed that kind of connection and that thinking, that contemplation piece. Then where we all fail is we move them into the shelter world, and that's where they stay way too long. And that's where it's very, very difficult to move over those stages. If we can get folks from that connection, shelter should, the shelter system. My PhD was on kind of the world of youth shelters. The shelter system was set up as a band-aid, interim, short-term stay. They've almost become extensions of child welfare structures, right? So that's where I think we're having a lot of problem with getting to those layers. If you can move folks, and we found that in our last study, if you can move folks quickly off the streets, either back home or into something more stable, they have a much better chance of kind of moving through those stages with care.
So let's just pick up on that then. So changes within the child welfare system to avoid issues around housing. Can you point to any changes or modifications that may be most appropriate given the results of your research and the circumstances you see here?
Right. And I know there's just a new announcement last week on the I think it was called PATH, where there's going to be increased funding for young people as they exit. So I think one of the key pieces that young people are leaving way too early. I mean the system, again, the system is there. They're doing the best they can as kind of surrogate parents, and it's not easy. So it's very easy to kind of constantly critique government. And then that's kind of not my point here. I know there's a lot of good that these systems can do. And that's why I layer it that a lot of these young people, they come with so much trauma in their world that there needs to be much better interventions in the child welfare system to work with those populations. B, leaving at 16 or 18. I mean, I've got two young adults. I can't imagine them leaving at 16 or 18 and being able to survive on their own, in their own, fine housing, fine employment, no way at all. So I think also we need to that's why we really need those transitional spaces. And again, it's all about resources. The system kind of works fairly well to a certain point. But then I remember one young person in our most recent study saying at 16, I got a birthday cake and a bus ticket. So we really do need that extra resource. Like we need the financial support, which I now PATH is going to be doing. And I know they extended to 18 for Crown wards. But even these days in this landscape, that leaving at 18 is so difficult, right? They're emerging adults, and there's no way. I mean, that's why we keep seeing them in the adult system.
Can you talk a little bit about outside of the main urban area? Because we focused a lot on downtown Halifax, but presumably all the issues that you spoke to that lead up to homelessness, the trauma and the lack of security, belonging, purpose, all those words that you used at the beginning would presumably apply equally to youth in the smaller urban centers and rural areas. So do you have some sense of how that dynamic works? And is Halifax bringing them in, or are there different sorts of populations outside of the city?
I mean, right now in the encampments, we're seeing a lot of folks that are coming from, regions outside of the downtown core. So definitely that's happening. We're seeing at the shelter system, shelter level as well. I did a study a few years back looking at rural communities and kind of the story of young people that are experiencing, kind of homelessness there. And what was really interesting was that a lot of young people, if they're experiencing the dynamics, whatever it is, with family, with systems out there, they will not stay there. Because these are small communities. Everybody knows everybody. There's a lack of anonymity. There's a lack of confidentiality. The young people, this sample that we were working with, there's a huge proportion in the LGBTQ plus community, and they just felt that it was so oppressive to be in these more traditional rural communities that could not accept who they were. And so they left. And so we were seeing in Halifax, and this is about 6 years ago, we were seeing, a real kind of outcrop of folks that have left rural communities feeling much more confident because there's more resources in the big cities, as well as a deeper layer of anonymity. But what was interesting was that there is now a bit of a kind of a mapping of young people actually returning, because now there's such clogging in the systems out in urban places that people are actually moving out. I was just kind of on a Zoom with NGOs across Canada, and they were saying that they're starting to see in Toronto, Montreal, young people actually moving a little bit back out because they're not getting the care they need.
There's a question here around workable strategies to create that full or maybe a more comprehensive housing continuum, and just reflecting on, you've mentioned Montreal several times. I know you've worked in Calgary or with youth in Calgary. Are there examples of where this has worked well and where there are some gaps which we might look to fill here?
So that's a great question. I think things were working pretty well before COVID and the major housing crisis. So I think we were starting to shift away from prevention. Everybody was adopting housing first. There was more talk about transitional interim style systems, but that's really key. I mean, as we all know, working with adolescents as a unique kind of development stage, when they're ready to do something, we need to kind of wrap around those supports or we're going to lose them. So having that available in Montreal, we were just lucky. We had we always had units available, or we could find an interim before we can kind of move folks into a different, more long-term space. So that was important. I think the landscape here is going to change in the next year or so. It's very easy for me to say, as I have a house, I feel I have stability, but there's been a lot of kind of new builds emerging that are going to be kind of, low or affordable, youth oriented as well. So there's going to be some more, maybe a little bit of more kind of space in these systems, but everything is so locked down right now that that's kind of why we really, really need housing that's outside the market, that is built up, that can be kind of sanctuaries and refuges for, I mean, not just youth populations, but getting folks out of the streets when they need to be. I mean, the encampment issue, like we wouldn't have, I don't think, these encampments if we had something to provide folks in the summer.
So believe it or not, we're already out of time. It's 9:15. I haven't even got to half the questions that have been posed. I've done what I can to move through them.
They could always reach out to me.
Yeah, right. And we capture all the questions and they will be passed on. And Steph usually spends a good part of the day just connecting all the various people who have questions to our presenter. So, but Jeff, I really want to thank you for your time this morning. Great presentation, great responses to the question. I'm sure we could go on for quite some time. So thank you so much for your work. And I'd like also to thank all of you who've joined us. It was a really large and engaged crowd this morning. I wish everyone a good rest of your day. And again, thanks, Jeff. Much appreciate your time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
All right. Bye-bye.